Was it immoral or illegal or both?
It was both. This was a war on people on welfare.
This is Mike. He's asked for his surname to remain anonymous. Tragically, in 2020, Mike's son died from an overdose. In the aftermath, Mike found documents showing that the government had been demanding $24,000 in debts from his son. This was part of the Australian government's once popular plan to crack down on welfare cheats.
They can stack shelves, they can pick fruit. If they knock back those jobs and they're not taking those jobs, then they shouldn't be getting the dole.
But here's the thing. As Mike contacted the government to settle the debts, he found that his son, in fact, never actually owed the debt to begin with. The story of Mike's son is just one of 443,000 Australians who received false debt notices from 2016 to 2020. But there's something even crazier. This debt collection scheme was entirely illegal, and the government knew that.
The RoboDebt scheme was a gross betrayal and a human tragedy.
So in 2023, the Liberal Party's Minister for Government Services, Stuart Robert, stood in front of the Royal Commission, our highest form of public investigation. He was asked point blank if he knowingly gave misleading statistics about the government's RoboDebt scheme.
But you're saying they were the departmental figures, but you knew they couldn't be right.
The name RoboDebt is political poison, but once it was actually a popular scheme. Now, the idea of a RoboDebt has been around for a while. Essentially, we have two ways of finding out the earnings of a welfare recipient. The first is the amount declared to Centrelink, our welfare body, and the second is the information provided to the Australian Taxation Office by their employer. If there were differences between the two, it would warrant further investigation.
What, are you suggesting that people pretend to be disabled in order to claim money off the DSS?
I don't know, I'm just saying there should be tests, that's all.
So, in the early 2010s, Australia had an average of about 300,000 discrepancies between Centrelink declarations and ATO records. Out of those 300,000, the government would investigate the top 20%. And to help understand this, I'm going to use an illustration. I'll introduce you to Corey.
I'm not taking off my glasses.
Oh, trust me, I've learnt from Layla. So Corey sells cricket bats but struggles to get much work in the winter. During winter, Corey reports an average income of only $300 per fortnight, qualifying him for welfare payments. However, during spring and summer, Corey gets a ton of work and he earns $4,000 a fortnight. For the 13 winter fortnights, Corey earned a total of $3,900. But for the 13 summer fortnights, he earned $52,000.
Okay, so if I do the maths, I earned $55,900 this year.
Correct, which means you average $2,150 a fortnight, which would actually disqualify you from welfare payments. This is called income averaging, and this is a useful tool for spotting potential overpayments of welfare. For that reason, Labor introduced it as a tool in 1994. But in Corey's case, Corey was never overpaid anything. In winter, he was earning $300 a fortnight and needed welfare to survive, and the discrepancy was easily explained. So for that reason, income averaging was only used as a last resort for if neither the employer or employee could provide records to explain the discrepancy. It only ended up being used in 20% of cases. But in 2015, Tony Abbott's government was on its dying legs, and after not living up to his promise to put the budget back into surplus, there was an easy target to be seen making up that revenue: welfare cheats.
Alright, I'm just saying there should be tests.
We're all ears, Gareth.
So in 2016, the Liberal government's RoboDebt scheme was set to rake in $3.5 billion of welfare overpayments. This would chalk off about 10% of the government's budget deficit. What this practically meant was that instead of investigating 20,000 cases a year, they would now investigate 20,000 cases a week. Something they simply didn't have the resources for. Now, remember, income averaging was used as a way of flagging potential overpayments, but prior to 2016, the onus of proof was still on the government. However, now under the Liberal government's new scheme, the onus of proof was going to be on the person receiving welfare. In other words, Corey now had to prove that he hadn't been overpaid. Effectively, the government had outsourced the investigation duties to the welfare recipient, but with a presumption of guilt. This automatic assumption is why the scheme is called RoboDebt.
My lord, is that legal?
I will make it legal.
So, was any of this legal? Absolutely not. For starters, creating a presumption of guilt goes against the principles of rule of law, which is considered a cornerstone of Australian law.
Under our law, only after a guilty verdict is anyone then guilty of a crime. And to get to that point, of course, the accused must first have their say in court.
But more specifically, the Social Security Act of 1991 lists over 20 grounds for the government raising a welfare debt notice against someone. And guess what? Income averaging wasn't one of them. In other words, before the scheme could even begin, the Liberal government needed to amend the Social Security Act to add that income averaging would be a valid way of raising a debt against someone. This, of course, would have opened up debate over the whole scheme, but, would have at least been following the Constitution, which requires governments to act in accordance with their laws. Instantly, the scheme attracted criticism. Take a look at Andrew Wilkie's comments.
We know for a fact that a great many people are simply unable to find the historic paperwork that is often required to clear up the matter.
By the following year, criticism for the scheme was starting to garner, and the Ombudsman got involved.
I've got one word for you. Ombudsman. I'm going to the Ombudsman.
Now, what's interesting was that though the Ombudsman was very critical of the process, they never challenged the legality of RoboDebt. This was taken as a win by the Liberal Party.
Just read what the Commonwealth Ombudsman has decided when he looked into this matter, and the Ombudsman has quite simply said it's entirely reasonable and appropriate for the department to ask customers to explain discrepancies.
So from 2016 to 2019, RoboDebt continued with quite minimal resistance. Despite garnering criticism from the Ombudsman and a Senate committee, neither of them really had enough teeth to properly challenge it. Meanwhile, the government had issued over $500 million of false debt notices. Instead, RoboDebt needed to be challenged from the ground up.
The Morrison government will pay out $1.2 billion to 430,000 former welfare recipients in the largest class action payout in the country.
So in 2019, Gianna Ramato opened a letter to find out she owed $2,754 to the government for welfare overpayments. She worked half the year and studied full-time for the other half, entitling her to Oz study payments. However, under the RoboDebt scheme, they income averaged her, and she turned to Legal Aid Victoria for help. They then challenged the debt notice on the grounds that income averaging itself was actually never lawful to begin with. And as that was happening, a law firm called Gordon Legal filed a class action suit challenging the entire foundations of putting the onus of proof on the people. They demanded compensation from the government. Now, the scheme was facing real legal pressure. In the Amato case, income averaging was successfully overturned as an automatic debt calculation, which then left the government exposed in the class action suit. In 2020, with no legal leg to stand on any longer, the government settled, paying $1.2 billion to over 400,000 people. These either came as refunds or simply dropped debts. A couple of months before the settlement, the scheme was scrapped. Just 2 years later, the Liberal Party was voted out, and the new Labor government forgave the 197,000 debts still under review. So it was all a happy ending. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you all.
Hold up, Mr. M.
Take off your glasses.
No. People's lives were ruined at the hands of individuals in the government. Was justice done?
Okay, saddle up. This video is going for twice as long. I'm going to need to open After Effects. Now, I don't know if you've realized, but YouTube is massively oversaturated with content. So I'm willing to guess that you've given up on that fleeting thought of starting your YouTube channel. But that would be ill-fated. The oversaturation issue means that well-produced content performs very well in the algorithm, and we can actually show you how to make your first well-produced documentary from scratch. All you need is Photoshop and After Effects, which you can get on a free trial, and just follow each tutorial in our course to start building your documentary. Not only can we get you animating whoever you want in less than an hour, but you also gain access for our editor's Google Drive with step-by-step guides for all the different storytelling techniques you see in a Mr. M video. Literally years of trial and error is distilled into a 1-hour course in a small Google Drive. For just $20, fast-track your journey to making videos on your passion today. Link in the comments. So one of Albanese's election promises was that there would be a royal commission into the RoboDebt scheme. Now, some people were referred for criminal prosecution, but who exactly they are has been kept from us. That being said, some people really caught the eye.
I remind the member for Paddon and Coalition, you are not the victims here.
The first was Scott Morrison himself. As Minister for Social Services, it was Morrison who actually brought the scheme before the government. Remember, this was an illegal scheme, and given that over 2,000 people work for the Department of Social Services, you'd think that someone would at least mention that to Morrison. Well, they did. And so Morrison was set to change the proposal. Yet just a few weeks later, without the proposal changing at all, Social Services told him that it was good to go to Cabinet. Sounds a little sus, right? Well, when Morrison went to Cabinet, he made no mention that there was at least a question of legality. For this, the Commission deemed him responsible for misleading Cabinet. Morrison argued that can't you just trust your department?
No, please don't interrupt me. I have given you the courtesy of not interrupting your answers. I expect the same, Mr. Morrison. Fair enough?
But there's still more. During a Cabinet meeting, Morrison said that the Department of Human Services had described income averaging as, quote, foundational to how they worked. This couldn't possibly be true, and so the Commission again ruled that Morrison had misled Cabinet. He also described himself as the welfare cop, and then as Prime Minister, he still had ultimate responsibility for the scheme's failures from 2018 to 2020.
The minister responsible for the bungled RoboDebt scheme has faced a grilling at the Royal Commission. Alan Tudge admitting he never tried to find out if the scheme was legal and refusing to accept responsibility for his department's failures.
So Alan Tudge was the Minister for Human Services when RoboDebt was launched, and while on the stand, Tudge was firstly pressed on these comments made in a current affair.
We'll find you, we will track you down, and you will have to repay those debts, and you may end up in prison.
The main issue here was that Tudge was clearly conflating compliance with fraud. So people with these huge false debt notices then came to the impression that they had defrauded the government. Not only that, but the Commission found that Tudge engaged in abuse of power and intimidation. This was by revealing personal information about a welfare recipient who had publicly criticised the state of Centrelink more broadly. Friend of the channel, Knights in Shining Llama, makes a great point about Tudge. He'd had plenty of scandals before. An extramarital affair with his press secretary, where she then accused him of bullying and intimidation. He faced contempt of court allegations in 2017, and as acting immigration minister, illegally detained an Afghan asylum seeker. Yet none of those scandals sunk him. However, only 1 week after he gave evidence at the Royal Commission, and well before the report was released, Tudge resigned from Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, I believe honoured to have served and proud of what we have achieved.
So next up on the list is Stuart Robert. He was the Minister for Government Services from 2019, so from when the court cases started to 2021. Essentially, RoboDebt died under his watch. But as the scheme reached the zenith of its criticism, Robert fronted the public to defend RoboDebt. However, while on the stand, Robert conceded that after a briefing from the Department of Human Services in July of 2019, he actually thought RoboDebt was illegal. Less than 4 weeks later though, he said this.
And of course, we cross-check it with the ATO, and if there's a discrepancy notice is raised. And that's the legal requirement we've got.
So clearly then, Robert knowingly misled the public about RoboDebt. But it's alright, he had a very good explanation. You'd never dog the boys.
Keeping in mind, if I've got a personal opinion, my next step is to seek the appropriate advice. Until such time as that arrives, I remain a Cabinet Minister and am responsible for holding the Cabinet line, which is what I've done in the interview.
But Robert's time on the stand got even worse. When asked why he also told David Spears that 99.2% of RoboDebt notices were correctly levied, even though that he no longer thought that the process was legal, he said this.
So what you said there, to your knowledge at the time, was false.
To my personal view, yes, but I'm still a Government Minister and it's still a government program. And this was the approach that Cabinet had signed off on 3 or 4 years earlier and had been going on.
Like Tudge, after giving testimony, Robert resigned.
Federal Minister Stuart Robert will quit federal politics within weeks, ending his long and controversial career.
The next culprit wasn't actually a politician, but instead a secretary of the department. This right here is Catherine Campbell, and from 2011 to 2017, she was Secretary of Human Services, and from 2017 to 2021, she was the Secretary of Social Services. Ministers change portfolios all the time, and so secretaries are the unelected supervisors of a department who then answer to the minister. She was also paid $900,000 a year. As a secretary, the Commission found her responsible for misleading Cabinet and for withholding documents when the Ombudsman did their 2017 investigation. In 2021, Campbell was promoted to Foreign Affairs and Trade. What's really interesting is that in the Commission, her successor in Human Services, Renee Leon, said the only reason that Campbell got that promotion was because the Liberals saw her as the secretary most responsive to their policy agenda. In other words, the most likely to do what they wanted without asking questions. After the report was released, Campbell was suspended without pay and then resigned. But there's one guy who I think has completely flown under the radar here.
You know, look, I did not turn my mind to the legality of the program. It never occurred to us.
Remember, RoboDebt actually started under Turnbull's leadership. He was the leader of cabinet meetings up until mid-2018. Now, of course, Turnbull's defense is that it never once occurred to him that this could possibly be illegal, which is odd considering he was once our most high-profile barrister. But more than just that, the Commission gained access to Turnbull's texts, and what they showed was that in early 2017, Turnbull was messaging Tudge over the scheme. For context, RoboDebt had been getting heat by this point, its legality had even been questioned, and in these messages, Turnbull didn't ask for further legal inquiry, but instead to make sure any negative press had, quote, settled down by the time Parliament returned. Even though Turnbull was excused, the failure of anyone to take leadership and accountability typified the entire scandal. The report was delivered in July of 2023, and the new leader of the Liberal Party, Peter Dutton, gave this as a response.
I just caution the glee of the Prime Minister and of Bill Shorten at the moment. Bill Shorten in Question Time, you've seen, has sought to politicise this issue from day one. There's a presumption of innocence in our country.
Of course, it was completely true that Labor used income averaging as a tool for investigation, increasingly so under the Rudd-Gillard government. However, they never shifted the onus of proof solely on discrepancies detected by income averaging. Remember, this started as Scott Morrison's policy to boast of recuperating $4 billion and bringing the budget back into surplus, the first time since the John Howard years. It was actually for that exact reason that many viewed him as the best economic manager that we've ever had. But I'm going to argue he cost the nation trillions of dollars. Click here to see why.